Yeah. Okay.
Force negatives.
Yeah. One of my first jobs in Seattle and the Asian.
Sort of.
Yeah, I think yeah. It was just like really fucking good, but yeah, it's more like maybe something like me. Yeah. Yeah. I like it. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, do you know if that's on or
All right, good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone in the room for joining us and the people online for being here as well. I've been the Attorney General for just about 8 months now, and first I just want to note that I'm immensely proud of all the work that's happening in the Attorney General's office all across Washington State. The work that we do on behalf of our clients and the people of Washington State, from consumer protection to healthcare to education to defending state agencies. There is so much work that is happening all across this agency, and we're all just trying to make Washington State a healthier and safer place to live for everyone. My office also continues defending Washington State on quite a few fronts against the illegal actions from the Trump administration. And I want to just provide some update on our work, some thoughts on some of the national events that are impacting Washingtonians, and then I would welcome your question. First, I just want to talk about the fact that we get frequently asked about the possibility of the National Guard being mobilized in Washington State. And we've seen this administration abuse the National Guard with deployments that are dangerous, illegal, and violate the founding principles of this country. He is taking away people from their jobs and their families to create a military state in American cities. We know that that could happen here based on what we've seen and the public comments made by this administration. Indeed, the president seems to relish on the idea of invading American cities. But they obviously don't communicate with us about their plans. We do track their actions closely and talk to our impacted state colleagues across the country. And we have ways to defend Washington from this kind of abuse of their rights. But I hope it really never gets to that point. But I can assure people in Washington State that this office will be prepared to do everything that we can to defend the rights of this state and the Washington State Constitution. Secondly, I want to address the continued erosion of civil rights and the blatant approval of racial profiling by the Supreme Court. This Monday's decision in Noem versus Perdomo, issued on the shadow docket, is an abysmal decision that will impact Washingtonians. In the short term, the decision allows ICE to racially profile Latinos in the Los Angeles area, or even just people that ICE thinks are Latinos, whether they're citizens or non-citizens alike. But in the long term, it opens up the door to race-based policing across this country and has the real likelihood of creating a constant state of fear in communities of color. It is a shameful decision. It basically says that people of color in the United States of America, regardless of their citizenship, are second-class citizens in the eyes of the law. And I do think it's important in these moments to pause and to think about the things that we are seeing on the national level, from the president, from the Supreme Court, and others. And if we don't pause and think about these impacts, we lose the importance of the moment. But we need to understand there will be consequences from these types of actions and decisions, not only now, but for future generations. And if these were normal times, this kind of outrage would generate a great deal of response across the country. Instead, the decision by the Supreme Court was just another Monday. But we in this office are doing everything that we can do to track these decisions, to track the actions from the President of the United States. And as a result, we are launching a new tracker that is available to the public, that gives the public access to the work that is happening here as we oppose these unjust and unconstitutional actions. We now have 37 lawsuits against the administration because this president refuses to follow the law and follow the Constitution and abide by things like the separation of powers. And those cases are based on our intent to defend workers, to defend students, to defend victims of crime, the environment, immigrants, and other core principles in our communities. We are also protecting vital funding to Washington State. Had we not been involved in many of these cases, the Trump administration would have eliminated an estimated $14 billion in funding that had been authorized by Congress to the people of Washington State. $14 billion that was threatened that we were able to protect. It's a head-spinning number. It's a huge amount of work to defend. And it's hard for anyone to really keep track of all of these cases and the relentless threats that we are seeing from the Trump administration. In fact, the administration would prefer the public be confused. Indeed, I think that is part of their goal and part of their point, bringing all of these executive actions to overwhelm the public and distract them from some of the core issues that they are working on. But because it's happening all at once, it is important that we continue to try to provide tools for the Washington public to make sure that they understand the work that is happening here and by so many of our partner agencies across the state. So the new tool that we are launching today helps people follow this work. It tracks both our victories and our setbacks. It links to case dockets, and we'll update this as we continue to litigate cases against the administration. And I can assure the public there will be more. And this is available now on our website at atg.wa.gov. We do all of this work on behalf of the people of the state of Washington. We want Washingtonians to see our work. We want to be as transparent and as accessible as possible. Most of all, we want them to know the results of this work. We are living through times where one day history will look back and ask what side of the law and what side of the people we were on. It will be known unequivocally that Washington State is on the side of integrity, fairness, and justice for all. I welcome your questions.
The Supreme Court decision you mentioned out of Los Angeles, does that immediately impact ICE's actions in Washington?
Well, the case was issued on the shadow docket, so it's not a full Supreme Court decision yet. So essentially what the court did was allow ICE's tactics to continue. And to be very clear, the tactics that they were using was targeting people in part based on their race, their ethnicity, the language they were speaking, the locations that they were spending time in. And it is interesting to me to see that decision and how many people just accept it. You know, it was just a couple of years ago when the Supreme Court weighed in on a different case involving the use of race or ethnicity in college admissions. And the Supreme Court said unequivocally that race could not be considered, that was blatantly unconstitutional. What they said on Monday was the opposite of that, that in fact, race could be used to detain people, to take away their liberties, to take away their freedoms. And we know that is happening to people who are both undocumented and citizens of the United States. So the immediate impact is limited to the facts in the case of it happening in Los Angeles. But to read the words of Justice Kavanaugh, essentially authorizing that kind of discrimination, is going to have an immediate impact on how ICE operates across this country. And I think we're going to see more and more of that sort of race-based policing happening. And should the Supreme Court ultimately extend that decision and formalize the decision in that case once they reach the merits, I do think it really just opens the door for not only federal law enforcement and immigration enforcement, but local and state law enforcement to also consider race, which is a huge reversal from all of the civil rights litigation that has opposed that sort of blatant race-based discrimination. And that is why it's been so important. And again, you know, this was issued on a Monday. It was a shadow docket decision, which is a crazy way to do justice in this country. And most of the American public has already moved past it, but it's going to have a lasting impact on many, many people across this country.
How do you fight Supreme Court that seems so blatantly conservative, I guess, supporting anything from the administration?
Well, you know, I think for me, I try to first put it in context. You know, there was a time in this country where the United States Supreme Court was the only beacon of hope for communities of color. You know, and I think about the bravery of not only prior Supreme Courts, but the judges across this country who recognize the humanity of people who were disregarded and disrespected and treated unlawfully by this country. You know, there was a time where we could discriminate based on race in all sorts of public accommodations. You know, and there were federal judges, including federal judges in Alabama and Mississippi and other states in the heart of the civil rights movement, who stood up and said, no, the law doesn't allow that. And now what we're seeing, I think, is a United States Supreme Court that takes a very different position. And I think it is a tragedy, frankly, that we are seeing that pull back from so much of the progress of equality and equity in this country. My job is first and foremost to defend Washington state law and the United States Constitution. And if we see actions by the president or anybody else, big or small, that are violating our laws and are impacting our state, we will act. The only other option is to give up, to retreat, to capitulate to this sort of illegal action. And that would be, I think, a abdication of my duties. We obviously have to, read and take in and take seriously the Supreme Court decisions and the precedents and use that as we analyze cases in terms of how we decide to move forward. But if we see things that are illegal and that are harming Washingtonians, we can't give up, and we will continue to fight back and continue to work to defend Washingtonians.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So today, Secretary of State Steve Hobbs announced that the Department of Justice is requesting a full copy of the state's voter registration database. Has your office had any communication with the Secretary of State regarding this request, and do you plan to fight the release of this information to federal authorities? Also, what do you believe that the DOJ's request signals about the administration's intentions or forthcoming actions?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the question. Yes, first and foremost, we are working directly with the Secretary of State's office and other client agencies that might be impacted by this request. And I just think that we should pause and clarify what the request is. The Department of Justice has requested 10 years worth of voting data here in Washington state. It's very similar to other requests that have been made into California and other states. And so we are working with our client agency to analyze that request, to analyze the legality of that request, and to make sure that if we have an obligation to respond, that we will do so accordingly, in accordance with the law. But I think the second part of your question really highlights how significant this sort of request is, because what we are seeing from this administration is a really full-throated attack on the state's ability to control their elections. We saw an executive order earlier this year that it directly attacked Washington state and other states that rely heavily on mail-in voting. That is a case that we are continuing to litigate right now with the state of Oregon. We saw another recent executive order a couple of weeks ago that again was going at states' ability to control their own elections. And this is despite very clear precedent that says that states have the ability to dictate the terms and conditions of their election systems. And the reason that the president is doing this, despite the clear authority saying that he does not have such ability, is because he wants to manage and control state elections. He wants to be able to control the outcome of elections. He does not like the results that he's seen in the past. He continues to lie to the American public about voter fraud that he thinks is rampant, which we know is false. He continues to lie about winning the 2020 election, and he wants very much to be able to control the outcome of the midterm election. That is why he blatantly said to the state of Texas, go find me 5 more seats in Congress, because he knows that the Republican majority in the House of Representatives is at risk. This president wants to dictate the decisions of the American public on so many different areas. And if you can control elections, then you can control the future of his policy priorities, and we can't let that happen.
Reuters is reporting that the DOJ is requesting this information for immigration and criminal law enforcement purposes. How are you prepared to defend Washington's voter rolls against that?
Well, look, if the request is illegal, then we will oppose it. If there is a legal basis for the request, then we will abide with the law. First and foremost, that is what we have to do in working with our client agency. So again, we continue just to analyze that request. I think it is pretty astounding that they're asking for 10 years worth of voting data. You can think about all the elections that have happened in Washington state and other states over the last 10 years. Well, we'll look at the request and let our client respond accordingly. John?
Change the subject, still Washington oriented. There's been some confusion over at the Hanford Reservation on whether the Department of Energy whether does or does not want to stop the vitrification plant over there. Right now, it says it indicates that it doesn't want to, but it's if you look closely at its statement, there's some wiggle room in there. Is this something that your office is monitoring? And if DOE decides we're gonna do something else besides gentrification, do they have a legal leg to do that, considering Tri-City, tri-party agreements in place?
Well, I'll start where you finished. I mean, the tri-party agreement puts some very clear conditions on the federal government in terms of how they're transitioning the hazardous material at Hanford, and we will make sure the federal government lives up to that obligation. I'm not familiar with the specific statement that you're referring to, John, but I would just say that we monitor that very closely in conjunction with our state agency clients. It is vitally important that we continue to hold the federal government to account. Washington State knows that this matter has been going on now for many generations and many federal administrations, but we will need to be consistent as possible to protect the people in Washington, to protect the workers who are operating at Hanford. There's also been some personnel changes from the federal government at the Hanford plant that we're tracking as well to make sure that the administration has the right type of leadership that will continue to live up to their obligations.
These two questions are from KHQ in Spokane. They requested these. One's about the 9-month backlog on DUI blood testing results. And what's being done to speed up that process.
I'm actually not familiar with that specific one, so I can happy to have the team follow back.
All right, cool. And the other one is you pinned a letter alongside 49 other attorney generals calling on the DOJ to crack down on offshore gambling sites. So can you speak on how and why a ban on offshore gambling would make Washington safer?
Yeah, we're seeing a ton of rampant offshore gambling through gambling apps and the like that I think are dangerous for a number of reasons. I mean, Washington has a certain unique gambling operations here that are largely based on our tribal reservations. But we're seeing a lot of potential abuse from offshore gambling, a lot of predatory practices from some of those gambling operations as well. You know, people often ask me about how often we collaborate with other Republican-led attorney general's offices, and that's a really good example where I think regardless of party, we can see the threats that are happening from offshore gambling. And at the end of the day, it's to protect people from some of the abuses that come with gambling and some of the fraud that we're seeing associated with it.
There's currently litigation between Texas and New York over New York's abortion shield law. And I wonder if you've heard or been contacted by other states regarding Washington's abortion shield laws and any challenges to those.
Well, Ken Paxton hasn't called me. That's what you're asking. I mean, we look very, very closely at what we're seeing from other states. Texas and some other conservative-led states have really tried to invade the privacy of people in Washington and other states that are trying to get their necessary healthcare. I would just say that our team monitors abortion access and healthcare access very, very closely, both from threats from other states and from the federal government. We've been monitoring federal executive actions on that very, very closely. We have seen prior attempts by both governments and other jurisdictions asking for healthcare data for people in Washington. But we have a very strong and protective law to protect people's healthcare data, and we will continue to enforce that law strongly.
Got a question on Zoom from Kyra. They're muted, go ahead. It sounds like you're muted on your side, if you wanna unmute yourself, Kyra.
I'm so sorry about that. James Lynch at Cairo News Radio. Just wanted to ask a question about the DOJ's threats to send the National Guard, federal officials, ICE into so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. Do you have a status update on that here in Washington? And is there a strategy about how you will combat that?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of bluster, obviously, from the administration, from the so-called border czar, talking about invading American cities. You know, the way that they talk about it, frankly, is offensive. They seem to relish and take some pleasure in the idea of sending the National Guard into American cities with duly elected mayors and representatives. We continue to have and will continue to defend the Keep Washington Working Act, which limits that sort of cooperation with federal immigration authorities. It's been a law of Washington State now for over 6 years. I think it has proven to be an effective tool to both generate public safety and commit to public safety while also protecting the civil rights of people, both documented and undocumented alike. If the National Guard was mobilized here, again, we will look to see the legal pretext for that and to see if there's actually a legal basis for that. I don't believe the president or the administration is utilizing the National Guard for public safety reasons. I think they're using it as a pretext for the authoritarianism that we're seeing from the Trump administration. Because if they were serious about addressing crime in America, they would work more closely with states and law enforcement across the country. They would also focus on the cities that have the highest per capita crime rates, which just is not Washington, D.C., it's not Chicago, it's certainly not Seattle. But that's not really what they're after. They're after creating a military state in American cities and really abusing how the use and the traditional purpose of the National Guard. But we will abide by federal law and Washington law and make sure Washingtonians are protected.
Another one on Zoom from Jake at the Washington State Standard. Jake?
Hey there, thanks. Speaking of federal requests for information, wondering if you'd been brought in at all on the request for information on Medicaid spending for immigrants without legal status recently, and whether or not you think the feds are entitled to that information and what you think that could be used for.
Again, it's one of those areas where, yes, our team is aware of the types of those requests. We obviously have client agencies that are impacted by such a request. And if there is a legal basis for those requests, then we will abide by them. It seems to me that the administration is intent on, despite all their public comments about making America healthier, is stripping away the healthcare and right to healthcare and access to healthcare for people, which does not make us safer. But we'll work with our client agencies to make sure we're fulfilling our obligations.
I have a pretty specific one. You with a bunch of other states, sued, I think in July, to stop the administration's reinterpretation of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act.
Say that again. I like it.
Yeah, I can.
We
Which
were.
protects, Head Start funding, among other things, for certain groups. The judge's stay on that expires today. I wonder if that's gonna be extended or what you know about what happens next.
Well, I never try to predict what's going to happen next. Ultimately those issues are before court, and we're in court with many other states challenging the administration actions. But I'll just tell you, we'll update you after today's decision or a court hearing about it. Any other questions? Well, let me just end by, again, thanking all the people that work in this office. I've said to many people, the Attorney General's office is the second largest law firm on the West Coast. We have people in 13 regional offices all across the state, and there's a tremendous amount of work that they are doing to make Washington better. And some of that work, much of the work that we're talking about today, is in the headlines and generates a lot of public attention, but there's also another huge bucket of work that has nothing to do with Donald Trump or the federal administration that is impacting Washington, that's making this a better place to live. And I'm proud to be in this position and working with my colleagues every day. Thank you, everyone.
Good.